This episode of Two Lost Souls is brought to you in partnership with langbuddy.ai.
Therapy, as we know, is all about language. Words and their meaning help bridge that gap between us and our clients' understanding of the world.
However, like anything in life, practice makes progress. And if you're learning a new language, LangBuddy is just the tool for that. LangBuddy is an AI language bot that you can talk to on WhatsApp. And it's not just about speaking either. It's about listening and understanding. LangBuddy can send you voice notes so you can train your ear to your chosen language.
That's amazing. Is it available in French?
Oui.
Spanish?
Si.
Lithuanian?
Tape.
Japanese?
Hai.
Swahili?
Ndio. In fact, there are over 300 languages and regional dialects available, so we could carry on doing this all day.
Well, luckily, given that it's an AI chatbot, you literally can. There's no waiting for it while it sleeps or eats. The learning never stops. And given that therapy and learning go hand in hand, we are pleased to offer listeners of Two Lost Souls 10% off your first month of LangBuddy by going to langbuddy.ai and using the discount code Two Lost Souls at the checkout. That's langbuddy.ai with the discount code Two Lost Souls.
LangBuddy. Improve your language skills by chatting with an AI native speaker.
Hi there, Editing Ravi here. Before today's episode of Two Lost Souls, I just wanted to take a moment to share an acronym with you all. The acronym I wanted to share is PICNIC, and PICNIC is an IT acronym that stands for Problem in Chair, Not in Computer. And sadly, on this occasion, the problem in the chair was me. Due to an unfortunate button-clicking error, the sound quality of today's episode point is questionable at best. So I just wanted to take a moment to apologise for that to start with. And I also wanted to take a moment to apologise for incorrectly referring to the University of Birmingham as Birmingham University. A huge error, particularly given that it is my alma mater. I also wanted to let you know that alongside this episode today, we do have some further episodes planned on career journeys and training avenues outside of a Talking Therapies environment. So stay tuned for those. But I also wanted to say a massive thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoy this episode of Two Lost Souls.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you are listening. Welcome to the Two Lost Souls podcast. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing anything and everything beyond the training journey. I am your host, Ravi Amrith. Let me just say that this is your podcast guide to surviving a high-intensity CBT course. We pride ourselves on creating a safe space for trainees, qualified therapists, and those who are generally curious. Honesty is our policy, and we tell it how we see it, but we'd love to hear your views too. As usual, I am joined in the therapy room today by the superb co-host of this podcast, Michelle Sudbury. How's it going, Michelle?
Hello, Ravi. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm good. I'm currently working on the on my long-term conditions course portfolio, so a little bit stressed out with that, but good otherwise. How are you?
I am not too bad. So I am currently completing the MBCT course, which is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Mm-hmm. And it's a relatively new addition to the offering within Talking Therapy Services. I think it's been about 2-3 years now as part of a kind of nice recommended treatment option. So as part of the training year, and then every year subsequently, actually, once you qualify, you have to attend a week-long, completely silent retreat. And I did my very first one, went to a amazing location, Amadown House, which is in Somerset. Can't recommend that highly enough. It's a beautiful venue. Amazing, so hospitable. It was just gorgeous. And came home last Friday, so I've just settled back into work a little bit this week. It's been a bit of a culture shock, actually. Being quiet is hard to get used to, but then when you get used to it, coming out of it is really difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's quite the gear shift. So, what did you learn from this retreat then? What are the reflections that came to mind? What did you learn about silence and the importance of it or non-importance of it?
I think the biggest thing I learned was how exhausted I was, actually.
Right.
So they kind of highlighted to us on the first day. So we got there on the Sunday afternoon, and we had a bit of a chat before the silence started. And one of the things that was really brought to our attention was how tired we might feel. And I thought, yeah, I'm always tired. I'm sure I'm going to be tired. Actually, I had this fatigue. So Monday and Tuesday, I was so tired, almost like, well, some people will be able to relate to this, that kind of early pregnancy tired where you just need to sleep. It was, horrific. But what I did learn was that being quiet means that you really hear things when they're said to you, when you haven't got any distractions. We weren't allowed to use our phones. We weren't allowed to read. We weren't allowed to do crochet or journaling or anything. So we spent about 9-10 hours a day with meditation. That was a mixture of kind of sitting practice, lying practice, but also movement, mindful movement. Is it Qigong, I think, is what we were taught, which is, just gorgeous. So we were kind of woken at 6, you start practice at 7, and then you go through till about 8:15 on the evening. But it was just brilliant. I didn't want to go, if I'm being completely honest. I was very apprehensive, a little bit resentful, a bit grumpy, but it was one of the best things I've ever done, actually.
Thinking about, when we speak to clients nowadays, the way they speak about relaxation a lot of the time might be watching a TV show, it might be scrolling on their phone, and there's always a sense of something going on in the background. There's always some sort of noise. So
Yeah.
I suppose, how did you cope with the remarkable difference between modern society as we know it and that meditation retreat?
It was, I won't lie, it was really difficult not to go back into those default behaviours. And I am one of those people that I crave silence, absolutely crave it. I'm really noise intolerant, but kind of like a bit perversely can't sit in complete silence, because actually then I'm so finely tuned into all noise that actually leaves me irritable. So when I'm working, I'll often have an audiobook on. If I'm not doing client work, I'll have something on. And it's something I've listened to before, so I'm a creature of habit. I like that comforting, repetitious noise. And moving away from that was really odd, because silence is really loud, I think. And that sounds ridiculous, but you can hear everything really finely tuned to nature's noises, your bodily noises, your tinnitus, if you're not, not lucky and live with something like that. And I do. And that was really a really difficult adjustment, and not being able to pick up a book or your phone to distract. That took a little bit of practice. And some of us did really, really well. Some of us didn't break any rules and stuck to it, the whole time through. I checked my phone a couple of times, and I messaged my husband a couple of times. I didn't call anybody because I'd made a commitment that I definitely wouldn't do that. But I wanted to check in on my kids and things. So I did a couple of WhatsApps. And then there were others who chose to do a bit of talking. So they took themselves off and had a little group chat, which I didn't want to do. But yeah, I'd really recommend it, even if you're not doing something like a mindfulness course. A few days away like that, it was really restorative, actually. A very good reset.
Right. And how do you think it might change the way you work as a practitioner, do you think?
Wow, that's a really good question. So while I was there, I was all like, oh my God, I'm going to have porridge every morning, and I'm going to get up at 6. I'll be out in the garden doing my Qigong and a bit of mindfulness every day. And then I'll come home, and I think on the Saturday, I actually did get up, go out, did some mindful movement, tried not to talk too much. By Sunday, I was right back into old habit, sadly. And then Sunday, I logged on, checked all my emails that I hadn't been able to check for the last week, and that's it. I'm right back in work mode. Really sad about it. Really sad about it. Because I don't want to be working at this pace. I've gone straight back into doing those 7:30 starts, 8:00 finishes, and it's that's a shame, isn't it? And I haven't eaten porridge, which I'm gutted about. I got back to my peanut butter on toast, which is much less healthy.
I suppose in terms of reintegrating that, and because it sounds like you developed quite a developed picture of what you wanted life to look like after that. What do you think you might do to get back to where you feel you want to go with it?
I think I've got to be really realistic. I had this very idealised viewpoint, which was easy to have when you're in a beautiful kind of, a beautiful country house on amazing grounds with just nature all around you. It's really easy to be idealised. Everybody was, we were catered for. We had 3 cooked meals a day, and I didn't have to do any housework or pick up any kids, or, I didn't have to do those jobs. It was really easy to forget that those things are part of my everyday life, and then coming home and having to put the washing on and think about food shopping, and so I think what I'd really like to do is develop some realistic goals in relation to that kind of element in my life. I don't really know what that looks like yet, but it definitely looks like reducing my working hours. That much I know. I don't know how I do that though, so that's a work in progress, I think.
Though it goes to show to everyone out there that, particularly as a practitioner, it's still part of an evolving journey, I guess, and that we go. It's interesting. I was speaking to someone about this earlier, where that we're almost always in search of the unfindable, in terms of always wanting to feel like we're the finished article and knowing everything we need to know or want to know, but actually those things change over time, and the goals we have as practitioners change over time as well. So I think more than anything, it's really positive that you're pursuing that journey and you're passionate about that journey, though. And I think that sends a strong message to people listening as well, that that there's still a journey to follow after you've finished the training process as well, which is obviously the topic of our podcast today. But before we move on with the rest of the show, let me just remind you all out there that if you've got any particular questions or topics that you'd like to see covered, reach out to us on Twitter at TLS_pod, or it's called X now, isn't it? So X, formerly known as Twitter, at TLS_pod, or by email at twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. So before we move on with the rest of the show today, I just wanted to share a research project that's actually happening at the moment by a former university tutor of mine and a colleague of yours, Michelle. So Andrea Hughes from Birmingham University is currently working on a PhD, and she's conducting some research into CBT therapists who are working remotely. So this is for individuals who have already qualified from their therapist journey. So if that's you listening, or if you know anyone who has qualified and would be willing to take part in this research on CBT therapists working remotely, please feel free to click the link in the show notes and be a huge help to inform the current data set we have available. We know that there's been a huge shift in the way we work as a result of the pandemic, and hopefully this goes some way to understanding not only the impact that working remotely has on practice and our understanding of how well we feel we do our roles, but also how we keep well while we do that as well. So we'd really appreciate if anyone could click the link in the show notes and complete that survey when they can. So today's show, as we've said, is all about post-qualification. So I suppose just to start with, and I suppose thinking about both of our journeys, really, Shell, what can people expect after they have finished that training journey? So they've just handed in their portfolio, they've just finished their final lectures and lessons at university. What can people expect at that part of their journey and the transition to the training wheels coming off?
I think one of the things that is possibly worth mentioning is that, I don't know about you, but you almost have this idea that you're done now. That's that. I've done my training. I'm a proper therapist, and that what's going to come from that is confidence and competence and all of those lovely things. And I'm not sure that was the case for me. And I know we've spoken about whether that was the case for you, and I don't think it was. From a practical perspective, what should happen is that the transition into qualified therapist is a slow and comfortable one. I think if you're working in a service that says, okay, there you go, get your 20 clients on your books and get on duty, and if that's happening a couple of weeks after you qualify, I think I'd really be pushing back on that. I think good practice is to keep up regular supervision as well. I think when I've been supporting trainees who've just qualified, we do keep our weekly supervision going for a few weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks, and then we transition into fortnightly, and then we eventually move into the hour and a half every 4 weeks, as recommended by BABCP. But you mightn't always need it, but to have it there, I think, is a helpful thing. Sometimes you don't use it as supervision. Sometimes it's more about your own anxieties, and it turns into a little bit of a kind of a bit of a therapy session sometimes. And I don't think that's a bad thing to have in place, because you've lost that university support. You're on your own a little bit. I would really love to think that across the country, trainees now are being eased into their role, and that there are realistic expectations on what they should or could be doing at this point.
You mentioned sometimes supervision becoming that space that almost becomes a bit of a therapy session to manage that change, and it's quite interesting. So a lot of people feel quite overwhelmed at the jump. It's an interesting time. So over time, as you mentioned, that the level of supervision goes down, your caseload goes up, understandably, because you're working more days. And I suppose, how does one manage that transition? How does one, I suppose, manage that sense of overwhelm and that sense of imposter syndrome that accompanies it, aside from things like using supervision?
I suppose I would, as a more newly qualified therapist, I think I'd throw that question back at you. How did you manage that overwhelm that occurred?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think the listeners are going to be in on something quite interesting here, because they're getting, I suppose, both sides of like a supervisory dialogue. So you were my supervisor at the time. You're also my team lead as well. So there might be angles on this that you had that maybe I didn't see. I don't think I managed that sense of overwhelm very well. I think I was still very used to the training journey. For me, the training part of the process was really enjoyable. I enjoyed my practice days, and I found that it was a really nice marriage, actually, in terms of having elements of learning stuff, but then being able to immediately put it into practice, and the variation between environments as well. And I think as soon as I lost that, it felt really difficult. And I think it got to the point for me, particularly with the volume of people that we are sometimes asked to see. Brendan used a great quote in our last episode, the sausage factory method or model of mental health, and I think it sort of became that for me. And it's really sad because I think I stopped seeing clients as clients because I was so focused on trying to make things work. And I don't think I really caught sight of sort of being in the moment and being in the session a lot of the times. I think also acknowledging, and again, this is another reflection on our last episode, where generally at step 3, a lot of the clients we're seeing aren't at step 3, they're step 3.5, sometimes they're step 4. It almost felt like being pushed into the deep end a little bit, and having a set of tools, to hang a picture frame, but being asked to build an entire house with only those tools and nothing else. So that felt quite demeaning in a way, actually, in terms of I felt really ineffectual. I felt as though all the tools that I had worked really hard to acquire and learn were of no use, and that was a reflection on me as a therapist. And I found that really difficult to sort of separate myself out from that and go, actually, it's not me. There are so many other things at play here. And again, I don't know. I'm curious as to how that sort of came across to you, because I remember supervisions we had where I was like, yeah, do you know what? I'm just not really. This doesn't seem like it's really working for me. And I'm wondering what you saw at the time and how things changed from an outsider's perspective over the course of that journey.
I think you really captured what I observed in that moment was a very vulnerable Ravi, actually, and it was completely at odds with the Ravi that I'd known for the kind of previous 12 months. You were never an overly confident therapist, in that you were never cocky as a trainee, and I really respected that. You had really realistic expectations of yourself, but you were very fair. So if you'd done something well and there was a good piece of work, or you'd particularly shone in a session, you were able to recognise that and reflect on it, and brought that to supervision. Equally bringing along the stuff that you were struggling with and the stuff that hadn't gone very well, and we'd listen to tapes together and you'd actively blush because it was a little bit cringy. That I think is that there was a real realness and authentic Ravi at that point. And then you qualified, and within weeks, I think there was a real change in what I noticed, what I observed. There was a lot less of you bringing your good stuff, talking about your good stuff, a lot more focus on the things that you felt weren't going well. You could really hear the pressure that you felt under. And I don't know if that was pressure that was actually there.
Well, it wasn't actually, I think, because I think reflecting on that time period, I still remember you saying, "Look, we're still really early in on this, and we're trying to ease you in. Like you're actually, even though it feels like you're in at the deep end, you're not. None of this, we recognise that you have just finished training. It's okay." Yet there was constantly me piling on the pressure to myself in terms of. I think part of it was maybe wanting to fit in, because there weren't, I suppose, 3 of us qualified at the same time, and in a staff team that was majority of people that had been there for quite a while, seemed really experienced. I think there was something in it for me of, I feel like I need to hit the ground running and fit in here and almost justify my existence in this team a little bit.
That's a really good point, because you're absolutely right. In your specific situation, you were in a very established team that consisted of quite a lot of longer term qualified therapists, rather than a new, young, dynamic team where you would be amongst lots of newly qualified people learning together. So that isn't something I've ever actually thought about until you just said it then. And I don't think that was in my awareness, actually, as you were you were kind of moving over. But it's really good to kind of hold that now, because I think that possibly was a factor. But yeah, it felt like a challenging transition for you at times, and I do recall kind of some supervisions where I don't know if I spoke to you about it, but I certainly thought, you sound like a therapist who's been doing this for 10 years. You sound kind of overwhelmed and exhausted by it all already, and that was really sad.
Well, that's really interesting, because even thinking further back from that, while I was still on training, I still remember a supervision where you said, make sure you don't get burnt out.
And without holding a torch up to your experience too closely, because I think that's really unfair to do that and pick apart your experience. I do think that, as we've said loads of times on this podcast, that you can't underestimate how difficult a year it is. And even if it's not difficult, it's exhausting. And that is just a fact, I think. I don't know anybody who's got to the end and gone, oh, that was a piece of piss. I just don't. Even the cleverest, most academically minded people have found this challenging. So perhaps there's something there that, as a team lead, as a supervisor, as team leads and supervisors who may be listening, what we really need to think about is, are we putting enough focus on making sure that people have got that work-life balance? Are we making them take annual leave regularly in order to prevent that? And then what does that transition look like? Are we asking too much? Are we preparing people adequately? Because maybe we're not.
Yeah, well, I think following on from that, and again revisiting the what we spoke about in the last episode around the steps maybe being slightly out of sync, considering the training that most of us go through is definitely dedicated towards step 3 and step 3 only. How do we progress in terms of how can we equip trainees for a world that isn't sort of clear cut in terms of them seeing step 3.5 and step 4 clients? How can that transition be better managed? And what advice would you give for someone who's trying to navigate that element of it?
Yeah, I know we've spoken about this before, and it's something I'm actually really kind of soapboxy about, but I do think that we shouldn't kind of manufacture the experience during the training year quite as much as we do sometimes. So definitely for your first few clients, right, take them from the step 2 list. That's absolutely grand. That is a gentle easing in, and it's a really good way to kind of start to familiarise yourself with some of the basics of CBT, because you get to practice 5 areas and all of that stuff. And then you've got to have your disorder-specific clients. So hopefully you're in a service that is spending time identifying, I'm going to air quote it, suitable clients, suitable on paper, but we don't know what you're going to get actually until you start working with people. And then there comes a point where that actually, I think, needs to stop. We need to stop identifying appropriate or suitable clients and actually just accept that you're working with a clinical population that are going to be different to, what you've been working with as a brand new trainee. If we did that, I think sooner in the training year, so maybe midway through, if we started that process of just picking up the next client on the wait list, just picking them up. Once they're not waiting for EMDR or, something like that, just pick them up and work with them, because you haven't got much more skill 6 months after that when you then are expected to just pick people off the wait list. So you're going to get more skill by working with those clients. You're going to have more knowledge because you're going to have to have gone out and sourced it. You're going to have to have done some reading. You're going to have to have used supervision. I really think that would make a massive difference to that. Oh my God, moment that happens when you look at your caseload of 15 to 20 clients and you think, this is so complex, this is so difficult, I don't know what I'm doing. You've had that experience already. It's got to be easier, right?
Yeah, totally. You spoke about reading there, you spoke about supervision, and I'm just wondering, sort of typically in these services, so when people are navigating that step up again, who else is there in the service to sort of lean on for support as they're navigating this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely clinical leads. So if we think about what a kind of talking therapy team looks like, from a stepped care perspective, step 3, and then clinical leads are really our bridge between step 3 and step 4, aren't they, for the most part, because in the majority of services, they're the people that have the conversations, the difficult, tricky conversations with psychology or other specialist mental health services. They're doing that on our behalf, but we can work really closely with a clinical lead. That can be very beneficial. We can learn a lot. It can be a really good experience. But I appreciate that isn't going to be everybody's experience. Sometimes you're in a service where perhaps you have an opportunity to talk to your clinical lead or your manager even, because they're quite busy. So I suppose it's then taking advantage of things like peer supervision that you should hopefully become part of once you qualify. That can be a rich resource pool, particularly in a service, where they have a more established workforce. You're not going to be amongst lots and lots of newly qualified people. You're going to have some experience there, and actually that can be really useful. But don't forget the basics, like your clinical supervisor, you've got management supervision, and you've got a buddy, hopefully. I think they kind of tail off a little bit. For some people, we might just say hello to them once, or the buddies forget that they've got a role to do as well, and can be a bit ineffectual, and that's not great. But there could be a good relationship there if it's allowed to kind of develop, and if the space is given for that to develop. So you're not going to get that clinical supervision support from them, but you might get a little bit of a shared experience of, oh, blooming heck, it's pretty challenging at the moment. We've got really heavy trauma. We've got lots of perinatal, and just a place to offload and debrief.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I suppose thinking back then, if you could go back and give one piece of advice to yourself after you had just qualified, what would it be?
Oh God, that's really hard to think of. I don't really remember my post-qualification months, I'll be honest. I think I've blocked them out somewhere. I was in a very strange position. I know I've spoken about it on here before, where I was one of one. There was just me. And
I suppose thinking about that, actually, sorry to interrupt, Shel, but just sort of thinking about that, and I mean, you spoke about peer supervision there, but also, I mean, I'm lucky in that my cohort, there were 3 of us that finished that journey together. How did you cope with that transition, given that that must have felt really isolating for you, given that you were the only one?
It really was. I'll be honest with you. It was really difficult, and I was a band 6. So we didn't have the automatic band 7 that we do now. So I was working at band 6, which meant that I didn't have opportunities like duty role. That wasn't open to me because you don't do that at band 6. And there was nobody else that had recently qualified either. There hadn't been trainees in the service for a really long time. So I didn't know who to talk to about things like the accreditation process or increasing my caseload. It was hard. It was really difficult. If you're in a cohort and there's a few of you, that's great, because you can go through that and stumble through it together, give each other advice. Hopefully you've remained close and friendly. That's probably not always going to be the case, but hopefully that's the case. And it's an extra layer of support. But honestly, I think I went into that a a bit cold. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how it was going to look. I think my diary increase was pretty quick. It certainly wasn't slow and gradual, and I wonder if that's why I'm so passionate about that happening now. That probably was a bit overwhelming.
Right.
Yeah, and I was quite a new member of the team anyway, so I didn't have lots of connections. So it was a bit of a strange experience, I think.
Yeah.
Further complicated by lots of service change as well. So that's a different issue.
Right, got you. I suppose thinking about further along the line, then not only just straight after qualifying, but also I suppose throughout your career. Then how does one sort of keep learning and developing as they go through this career? Because I think sometimes people can feel that that's I've been given this base set of knowledge, and now what do I do? I can't just be kept with this. Things keep changing. So where do I go from here?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I do vividly remember after qualifying was coming out with this enthusiastic desire to go and do some ACT training. I was like bubbling to go and do some ACT. And I remember having an appraisal just after I qualified, and enthusiastically walking in and going, yeah, let's do some ACT. Let me do some CFD. I really want to do these things. I want to get third wavy. And just being shot down immediately with well, no, you need to consolidate. You've just done a quite an intensive training year. You need to go and consolidate and develop that skill first. And at the time, I was really disappointed and thought that, wow, what a block. But hindsight's great, isn't it? And on reflection, that was a very sensible thing to be told to do. I wouldn't be in a rush as a newly qualified to go and do lots more training straight away, because you're gonna, start to find your feet with the different presentations with your clients, and you need a bit of time to do that without having something else in your head muddying that up, I think. I don't know. Do you agree with that, or do you think that you're fresh out of learning, you're ready to go back into learning?
I definitely agree with that. I think that if you're, and this might sound like this might sound a bit controversial if I word it in this way, but I think if you're doing it properly, if you're doing CBT properly or any form of therapy properly, I think it's going to have a life of its own, and you're going to be continually adapting it anyway based on what you encounter session by session. And that's where you do your learning. You do your learning as you're talking to people and as you're in these sessions, because if you're sort of continually reflecting on them, what you do is you integrate what you learn case by case and session by session, and eventually mold your practice, and it never stays the same. That being said, though, I appreciate it's always really nice to be able to add more strings to our bow. And so I suppose in terms of sources for that, even being a member of the BABCP, keeping an eye out for like the training adverts in their magazine. But you're right. I think that the consolidation period, particularly after you've finished the training, is the sort of integral part of this. And you also, and let's not forget, you've got the big job of accreditation to get done as well. So you don't want to sort of overdo everything and cram everything all into that 1 year when it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, definitely. Take your foot off the gas a little bit in terms of the learning, and learn in a different way. I think, yeah, it's a really good way to describe it. But then once you've been doing that for a little while, you are gonna hopefully start to develop either specialist interests or areas that you particularly like working with. You might also develop areas that you really dislike working with, and then some avoidance kicks in, but that's a whole another podcast, I think. So yeah, it's then the opportunities to maybe facilitate things like groups. That's a great way to develop, specialist interest, or become a champion in a particular area. So, or a lead. So like a perinatal champion or an access champion, whatever your interest is, I suppose. And then you've got your formal learning and development, haven't you? So things like supervisor training, LTC, which we've all got to do now anyway, so you'll get put on that. And then your other specialisms, things like your EMDRs, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, obviously, that's there. Some people do some ACT kind of top-up training. I did an ACT-informed trauma training. It was only a one-day course, but it was very interesting. I think the problem with doing too much third wave learning is that we can't always incorporate it into our practice because it's not currently one of those nice recommended treatments, which they need to hurry up and change, I think, because third wave is here. Let's embrace it. But again, that's probably a whole nother podcast. Yeah. What do you think is going to come next for you, Ravi?
That's a very good question. I don't think I'm ready to think about it yet. So as I mentioned, I'm still sort of tying up the loose ends on my LTC portfolio. That's occupying, I think, about 85% of my brain space at the moment, with the remaining percentage being occupied by the new dog I got recently. So I think once I sort of get the portfolio out of the way, then I'll be able to maybe have a bit of a clearer mind as to where I'd want to go. But I think definitely in my mind, more third wavy stuff. I think ACT is something that I resonate with and that I have tried to liberally sprinkle across my practice. But I think it's also something that I would like to develop my knowledge in. I think particularly in the location that I work in, I think sometimes it can come across as a little bit hippie sometimes, and people don't always resonate fully with the concepts, and I don't think that's anything to do with the approach. I think it's more about my knowledge base and the way I can work to potentially adapt the concepts that exist within it to the local population. So I'd like to learn about that a bit more, and hopefully develop my knowledge in that area. But one thing is for sure, though, you will never catch me doing a week-long silent retreat, I'm afraid.
Never say never. You don't know what's around the corner. Never say never. And let's not gloss over Carly, the dog.
No, let's not gloss over Carly the dog. She's currently having a nap. If you heard any whining or scratching at the start of today's episode, it wasn't me, it was the dog. But she has now since been fed and is nice and calmly napping on the sofa.
Fabulous. Oh, that's so lovely.
But I think the main takeaway from this that we'd like to share is that even though you think the journey's over, it's only just begun. And what we will do on that moment is we will take a break and we will be back very shortly. Welcome back to this episode of Two Lost Souls. So for the second part of today's show, we're going to be discussing something that's, I suppose, quite pertinent to one of us at the moment. And thinking of career journeys after qualification, we're going to be looking at moving services. So there may or may not be one of us co-hosting this podcast right now who may or may not have moved services. And I suppose to start with, what's it like, first of all, engaging in that transition?
Oh, that's a really big question, Ravi. It's different. It's an experience. I have, to this point, worked only for one trust, one team. And that has been the sole kind of experience in the NHS that I've had. And now I've moved. So I've moved across working for a different trust, but in a very similar role to that I had in my previous service. And it's been really interesting in lots of ways. there's definitely something about me managing my expectations about what things might look like when you go to a new team. It's come with lots of challenges, and perhaps I wasn't as prepared for those as I could have been. But there's also been some amazing things as well that have happened as a result of moving over. So it's so interesting to see different working practices, and to be exposed to things that are outside my normal. And I've really loved actually my own response to kind of being involved in a meeting where we might be talking about something like the duty system, for example, and I've said, well, we used to do this, as though that was kind of gold standard. And of course it isn't. Every service is going to develop its own way of working. And having to be uncomfortable with new ways of working, I suppose, has been something I wasn't expecting. Kind of thought it would be the same.
Well, I'm glad you said that, actually. So you've spoken there about different working practices, own ways of working. What has stayed the same and what has been different about moving to a different locality and a different team?
So I haven't moved far. So one of the things that's definitely the same is our clinical population. So the people that we work with are as poorly, unfortunately, as they were in my previous role. And we all know the challenges that come from that. It means you're probably going to have some longer wait times with people who probably shouldn't be with us at all. They should be with different services, getting different and specialist support. But I think that's a national thing. So what has been really different is the dynamics of the team I'm in now. So it's really big at step 2. We've got a very big step 2 kind of workforce, and incredibly well managed. Not to say that it wasn't in my old team, but it's very well managed at step 2. Very self-sufficient, and the seniors there have very clearly defined roles, which seems to be working ever so well. So yeah, I haven't had a lot to do with my step 2 colleagues, actually, because they just get on. Step 3 is comes with a little bit more variety. So we have the other modalities as well. So MBCT, IAPT, DIT, PCE, which is great. And they're quite an ambitious workforce. So there's lots of desire to grow and become managers and go on to become clinical leads and really keep developing. I think the biggest difference that I've experienced is the establishment of the workforce. So just as we were kind of talking about earlier, I was going to say experience. I don't know if that's right, but it's a newer workforce. Lots of people who've been newly recruited, a bit of a younger team, perhaps than I've come from, and I think that's just given it a different energy, if you know what I mean. It's a little bit of a buzz in the air. People want to be kind of progressing, which is great.
Right. I'm curious as well, actually, because you said earlier that you thought that it might be the same, or you thought it would be the same in terms of that transition. So thinking about, again, this wide rebrand that we've been on recently. So we're no longer IAPT, we're all Talking Therapies. That is a nationwide kind of approach. Even when we think of the NHS, it's the same logo that's put on everything. How much do you think that shaped your expectations of it being like a consistent, I suppose, landscape across both places?
That is a really good question, because actually I think it should. I think it should represent, the Talking Therapies logo should mean that a client entering a service in the north of England should get a very similar experience to a client entering Talking Therapy service in the south of England. that isn't happening. I don't feel. Lots and lots of individual kind of practices and ways of working that don't sit outside of, the IAPT manual, the Talking Therapies manual. So they're not incorrect, they're just different. And I'm not saying that we should have these, kind of completely replicated services across the country. There have, of course, got to be variables dependent on the people that you're working with, your clinical population, and your staff. But they're very different, very different. Things like session lengths, things like, courses of treatment lengths, very different. Even down to, what's on offer. Being across a border shouldn't exclude you from a certain type of therapy, just because your postcode defines that you're not allowed to receive it. It's not available to you. And I'd love to see that standardised. I think there's a big piece of work happening at the moment. There certainly is in the trust that I'm in, which is great. So the trust that I work for at the moment has got several talking therapy services within it. And we're currently working to do more of that, more of a kind of aligned practice, so that exactly that happens. Patients, clients don't go from living on one street and being under one GP practice and having one experience, and moving 4 mile up the road and having a completely different one. That shouldn't be happening. And yeah, that is a bit shocking, I think.
Yeah, it is. And I'm curious, actually. So thinking about the fact that you've embarked on this journey quite recently, how would you say you've coped with that lack of standardization, with the changes in process and with the changes in working arrangements? What were the things that you did to ease that transition somewhat?
Actually, I think I probably had a bit of a similar response to your your transition from trainee to qualified, in that I feel a little bit unsure at times, because things are quite different, and there's a newness there. I'm having to kind of reach out to my colleagues a lot more to find out about local services and pathways and things that I was really confident with in my last role are all new to me again. So that brings its own sense of wobbliness. I don't know a better word for that. And a few anxieties. But yeah, I think generally it's going. I'm coping with it okay. It's that new job, long hours type thing, though, isn't it? Where you're trying to play catch up all of the time, and I'll be glad when that bit settles down, when I stop being the new girl. Yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, because I think, you mentioned similarities there with what I went through in terms of my step from training to qualification, and I resonated a lot with what you said just there, and it got me thinking, actually. So we spoke about for us, on the shop floor, as it were, we've got things like supervision, peer supervision, and networks around us to be able to discuss these things and obtain support where we need it. When you go up the chain, because thinking about your role as a team lead, who do you get support from?
Yeah, that is something I've been thinking about a lot, actually. It's really funny that you mention it, because I'm part of a fabulous kind of management structure in my new role. I've got an amazing clinical lead. I've got a kind of a peer team lead. So there's 2 of us, which is great. And the most amazing, kind of holds us all together, fabulous. I think she's now the business lead, but she was essentially our office manager. But yeah, immense. So in that respect, there's always somebody that I can go and reach out to, get support from, which is gorgeous. I have a manager as well. He's an incredibly busy man. but makes himself available as much as he can do. But actually, there is a lot more self-sufficiency, I think, when you move up, and things like supervision do fall off a little bit, sadly. Particularly at the moment, my clinical work is quite low. Just kind of enough to get me through reaccreditation, actually, but it's very low. There's a lot more that needs doing from a managerial perspective. So yeah, having peer support is difficult because there's not many of you. You don't go to things like group supervisions all that often. I am invited to go, but sometimes it's a time thing. Management supervision can be a bit sporadic. It can be hard. It can be hard. But I've got good colleagues. I keep in touch with people. I'll just bother you if I'm having a bad day. I'll give you a call and have a bit of a cry or whatever. So that's all good. But it's very different. Yeah, it's very different. I'm not sure it's a priority, actually, which is quite sad, isn't it? I'm not sure it's a priority. The higher up the chain you go, I think things like support get forgotten a little bit.
Right.
Which is a bit sad.
Well, that is quite upsetting, but and at the risk of, I suppose, turning this into a longitudinal formulation, I mean, I thought it was quite interesting, though. I mean, you spoke there about self-sufficiency, and I just found myself thinking about what you went through again in that transition from training to qualifying, and I'm wondering if having to navigate that journey on your own sort of set you in good stead for what's followed up since and what's happened as you've climbed up the ladder?
Very possibly. I've never really thought about it, actually, but very possibly, yeah. I think I can be quite needy, actually, Ravi. I do like to seek some validation and support occasionally, and I can and I get passionate, probably is the right way to say it, or soapboxy or gobshitey, as it's been called before, about things, and sometimes need somebody to bring me down a little bit, to help me to see other perspectives. So I'm getting better at reaching out for that kind of support. But yeah, I don't really go and seek supervision and things. I need it, I want it, but it's not a priority, which I think is really sad now that I'm talking about it, because I've waxed lyrical on here lots and lots of times about how important supervision is. I worked as a clinical supervisor before coming back into this role. I'm going to be supporting trainees at university with supervision. It's one of my biggest passions, and it's a bit of a contradiction that I'm not really valuing that for myself, isn't it?
Where do you go from here with that, do you think?
I don't know, but you've got me all reflective, and I'll have to go and journal. I might do a practice. I might go and meditate about it. I won't. I definitely won't. I'm far too tired. It's not going to happen today. But seriously, though, I'm probably going to have to go and speak to somebody about that, because it's really important. I need a supervisor. Yeah, it's a bit of a light bulb moment. Thank you.
That's all right. Well, it's really interesting. I think supervision is one of those things, like it's obviously a BABCP requirement, and we're meant to get a certain amount of hours in. And I think it's really frustrating when it takes on that sort of box ticking sort of element, because I think it's really valuable. There's been a period recently where I didn't get much supervision simply because of calendar clashes and being on this course, and I think it was only the next time I had supervision that I went, oh God, I really needed that. It was almost like a drink of water in the desert in a way. But I think for you to see that before it gets to that point, I think is a really strong thing. And I think it sounds like a really powerful thing to be able to have that conversation as well. So keep us updated. I'm looking forward to hearing how that moves forward.
I might bring my new supervisor on once I've found one and introduce them on the pod. Yeah,
that'd be great. That would be great.
Yeah. If anybody wants to supervise me, if you're listening, fancy supervising me. Give me a bow. That'd be great.
Well, I'll be honest. I mean, this episode has been quite deep and meaningful. So, I feel like this has been in its own way supervision in itself. So, just before we sort of wrap things up for today's show, just a reminder that, you know, if anyone's got anything else that they would like us to discuss on the show, be it in a jovial and light way or in a deep and meaningful way, feel free to reach out to us at TLS_pod on X or Twitter, if you're still calling it that. Or reach out to us via our email at twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. Just to round off today's episode, if you've enjoyed or learned anything from this episode, please give us a follow and let us know on Twitter or X at TLS_pod or by email at twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. We've got some amazing episodes coming up, so we're looking into episodes on equality and diversity, on ACT. If there's anything else you want to see, give us a shout and we would love to explore it. Links, as we mentioned earlier, to Andrea Hughes's PhD study, and a reminder that's for qualified CBT therapists only, are in the show notes. And if there's anyone you know who would benefit from hearing Two Lost Souls, please share this podcast with them. It really is a huge help, and it means so much to us when we see people sharing our links and the lovely things that people have said about this podcast in the past. So thank you very much for doing that. But just to round off, all there is to say is a massive thank you to Shell.
Thank you, Ravi.
And a big thank you to all of you out there for listening. And we will see you next time on Two Lost Souls.